But first, the outsider president-elect contemplates an insider cabinet. Donald J. Trump was holed up today in his namesake Gotham City skyscraper, which Secret Service protection has now turned into something of a fortified midtown compound. Inside, in addition to sitting down for an interview with 60 Minutes that will air on Sunday night, Trump began the process of shaping the government he hopes and plans to assemble. In a stunning announcement this afternoon, the soon-to-be 45th president of the United States told the world that his number two, Mike Pence, will take over his transitional endeavors, demoting Chris Christie to the position of vice chair of the team that he'd been leading for months. So far, dozens of names have been floated for administration positions, from J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon for Treasury Secretary to Sarah Palin as Secretary of the Interior. Some on Trump's list are high-ranking state-level officials from the heartland of America, but others are the very types of D.C. swamp dwellers and East Coast elites that Trump spent his entire campaign disparaging.
So we broke the prospects up into three buckets. There are the bigwig Republicans like Chris Christie, Newt Gingrich, Rudy Giuliani, and the retired three-star general Mike Flynn, who took a gamble backing Trump early on in this race and now may want to be part of the administration. Then there's Trump's political team, people like Kellyanne Conway, Steve Bannon, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, Steve Mnuchin, and Corey Lewandowski. These are devoted operatives in Trump world. They may be recruited to work in the new administration or as advisors to the administration. We're told that both House Speaker Paul Ryan and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell told Trump yesterday when the president-elect was in Washington that they'd like to see Reince Priebus, the RNC chairman, as the White House chief of staff. Our third bucket is D.C. insiders. It features people like the former Bush National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley, whose name has been floated by some as a possible Sec of Defense, along with the current Senate Foreign Relations Chair Bob Corker of Tennessee, and the former UN Ambassador John Bolton. So, John Heilman, who's got the inside track on these biggest jobs right now?
Well, the one thing we know about Donald J. Trump that we've seen over and over again is that loyalty really matters to him. And so, you know, these folks, especially folks like Chris Christie, obviously it doesn't look like loyalty is ironclad. You know, he got a little bit of a demotion today. That's a significant thing. But I think, you know, Chris Christie is someone who will be paid back in some way.
I disagree. I think he may get no job.
Really?
Yes.
No job whatsoever?
I believe that.
On what basis?
That Jared Kushner may not want to see Chris Christie in the government.
The Kushner veto.
I believe Chris Christie, Christie right now is repeating.
I want you to stop, though, right now, because I want you to explain to the world why Jared Kushner would be opposed, because not a lot of people know this story.
Chris Christie was the U.S. attorney. He indicted and convicted Jared Kushner's father.
Yeah.
And then made sure his sentence didn't get reduced, as I understand it. Christie got shut out of being vice president in part because of this.
Right.
And I believe now he may well be shut out of any job in the administration because of this extraordinary personal backstory. He can
still bring the McDonald's, though, right? Kushner would allow that.
Probably still allow that.
Okay, all right. So
Rudy Giuliani, I'm just going to run off my current thinking.
Go. Rudy Giuliani gets a job.
Rudy Giuliani, Secretary of State or Ambassador to England.
Or Attorney General. Attorney General.
I don't think Rudy Giuliani will be Attorney General.
Let's pause and just talk about things that we both agree on.
Yeah.
One thing that's true is that Rudy Giuliani is probably Senate confirmable, and there's no way that whatever Democrats end up doing in terms of filibusters, Rudy Giuliani would get confirmed. I don't think he wants to be Attorney
General. I think he wants to be Secretary of State.
But so in a confirmable job, this is one of the things that Trump has to contemplate. Who's confirmable, who's not? Giuliani confirmable.
If Trump had his way, he'd pick Bannon as chief of staff.
Yeah.
But he's being told by people it's so controversial. The imaging would be so bad.
Oh my God.
Now remember, one thing
those people are right.
One thing past administrations have done in order to avoid minimize conflict and controversy is to announce groups of people. So you announce Bannon if you want him as chief of staff with a bunch of other stuff. The two dominant people in this transition right now, along with Mike Pence, are Bannon and Jared Kushner.
Yeah.
And I think you'll see Kushner not take a government job because of nepotism issues, but he will continue to be a highly influential figure in the Trump administration, even outside the government.
Let's just be clear about this. Steve Bannon had a huge role in getting Donald Trump elected president. It had a huge role. Behind the scenes, it was an important player. But it would be, if Donald Trump puts him in the most powerful job in America next to President of the United States, which is really what White House Chief of Staff is, it will create a firestorm.
I'm engaged.
Given the nature of Breitbart, given the nationalist tendencies, it would be the most inflammatory thing that Trump could do.
I'm engaged in informed speculation when I say I think Steve Mnuchin will be Treasury Secretary. Mnuchin.
Yeah.
With Treasury Secretary.
I think
you could see Bannon as Chief of Staff and Reince Priebus as Deputy Chief of Staff.
Yeah.
And I'll say again, they're looking for a whole bunch of people. A lot of people like Christie, who people think are up for jobs, I don't think are going to get jobs they want.
It will tell us a lot, though, about whether the kinds of noises that Trump has been making, the accommodating noises, the way he handled himself at the White House, the outreach to people like Schumer and Pelosi, all of that. It will tell us a lot if he decides this choice of chief of staff. He decides to go Bannon rather than Priebus. Priebus would be the reassuring, establishment-friendly choice, not just reflected by Ryan and McConnell, but just across the board. It would be a big, for a Republican president with all Republican control in Washington, a relatively inclusive,
I think
calming thing to do.
I think you're going to see a Democrat get a big cabinet job. And I'll say this, Trump may change his mind, but right now, anyone who's crossed him during the campaign...
they're out. For sure. And they might have retribution brought up on them. Do you think that any of these guys, I know the bell rang, I still want to ask this question. Do you think Hadley, Bolton, any of these guys will end up running national security?
I don't think Corker will.
These are a lot of these guys are neocons. They are not in line with Trump's
the one name we didn't talk about.
Restrained foreign policy.
The one name we didn't talk about was Senator Sessions.
Yeah.
I believe he could be Attorney General.
Okay, that I think is very, very plausible. Okay, Donald Trump is not the president yet, but he is the focal point of the palpable tension that can be felt across this nation right now. Since the election, anti-Trump protests and racially charged incidents both seem to be on the rise. Demonstrations last night led to more than 150 arrests in Los Angeles, and law enforcement in Portland, Oregon used pepper spray and rubber bullets to disperse crowds after what the police called anarchists, that's in quotes, began breaking office windows and vandalizing property. Before nightfall, much of the political world was reflecting on Trump's conciliatory demeanor and presidential-ish tone during his visit to Washington, D.C. Then Trump signaled that he was unwilling to change at least one campaign season habit of his. That would be his late-night Twitter lashings. At around 9 p.m. Eastern Time, the New York billionaire decided that thousands of protesting Americans deserved one of his trademark counter punches. He tweeted, quote, "Just had a very open and successful presidential election. Now professional protesters incited by the media are protesting. Very unfair!" Exclamation point. Facing criticism that his social media outburst might incite more unrest, Trump tried to walk things back this morning when, just after 6 a.m., he put out, yes, another tweet. Quote, "Love the fact that the small groups of protesters last night have passion for our great country. We will all come together and be proud!" Exclamation point. Can't believe he actually wrote those words. Don't sound like him. Anyway, meanwhile, horrific and shameful incidents of racism, hate speech, and even some hate crimes have been reported across the country in recent days. Social media posts have depicted celebratory Confederate flag waving, white supremacist graffiti, and other deeply disturbing incidents.
Parents of children at one middle school in Michigan are upset after some students were heard chanting, "Build the wall."
The student said he was called the N-word, and the teacher was not around in the room. People were in tears.
Dear Muslims, immigrants, women, disabled, LGBTQ, and all people of color, we love you boldly and proudly. We will endure. By Thursday morning, the sign looked like this.
This picture that was taken by a woman who saw something hanging from a balcony.
Police are investigating the graffiti as a possible hate crime.
Beyond that, all that stuff, there's been multiple reports of Muslim Americans being physically assaulted by what appear to be Trump supporters. The president-elect has not yet said anything publicly about these occurrences. So, Mark, what obligation? President-elect Trump is the president-elect, not the president yet. We abide normally by the truism that we only have one president at a time. But what obligation does Donald Trump have right now to speak out about these incredibly troubling occurrences?
This is a moment of truth because these things are happening. I won't say they're his fault, but they're happening as a direct result of his candidacy and of his election. He bears some measure of responsibility. I should say, I won't say they're all his fault. He bears some measure of responsibility. It would be good for his presidency, good for him as a person, good for the country if he would condemn these things in no uncertain terms. And I just wish he would, because he's going to get off to a slow start or a fast start. Everyone in the country wants him to succeed. He should speak out. I don't know why he wouldn't.
If he wants to be a successful president, if he wants to do what he says he wants to do, which is be the president for all Americans, he must speak out. Because the reality is that it's not his fault that people are racist in America. That's not his fault. Yeah. But he ran a campaign that was, in some cases, directly racist. In other cases, that exacerbated racist sympathies and racist feelings that people have. He ran an ugly campaign, an ugly, nasty, divisive campaign. He won. It's true. But now, if he, again, really wants to live up to what he has said, which is that he wants to try to bring the country together, he's got to step forward and say, take some responsibility for having having made this situation worse, and renounce these acts, renounce things that he's said in the past, and appeal to people's better angels.
You may be asking for more than he's actually going to do, but all he needs to do, as far as I'm concerned, is say they break his heart and they're not American.
Yeah, well, yes,
they're not the best of America. They break his heart.
Well, look, I don't know what he is capable of saying, but I think if he were to take some measure of responsibility on himself and say, I know that in some cases in this campaign I crossed the line and I incited some negative feelings.
I'd like him to do that,
but I know. I'm just saying.
Trying to be realistic, but think how powerful it would be if all he said was, "These things break my heart. These are not in the best spirit of America. We need to come together."
Well,
one tweet. I don't even think that was 140 characters.
Think he needs to go further than that if he wants to be a successful president.
Up next, we'll talk about the drama that's still unfolding and will be continuing to unfold within the Democratic Party after these words from our sponsors. Democrats remain dazed and confused about what happened in this election, but already there's a power struggle brewing over who will lead the charge against the Trump presidency and who's going to lead the party through this difficult rebuilding phase into the midterms and then the next presidential. There's been almost a total lack of explanation from Team Clinton about what they think went wrong on Tuesday night. In his first statement about the election today, the outgoing Senate Minority Leader, Harry Reid, made no mention of his party's failings. Instead, he attacked Donald Trump, calling the next president a, quote, sexual predator who lost the popular vote and fueled his campaign with bigotry and hate. As for the future Democratic leadership, the former DNC chair, Howard Dean, is going to run for the position of party chair, as we told you last night. He wants to return to the 50-state grassroots strategy he championed when he had the job before. The former Maryland governor and presidential candidate Martin O'Malley and the labor secretary, currently Tom Perez, says they're also thinking about applying for the job. Most of the momentum, though, in this race early on seems to be building behind the Minnesota Congressman Keith Ellison. He's not officially jumped in yet, but he's already got the support of Chuck Schumer and Senator Bernie Sanders. So, John, when it comes to Democratic opposition, who is going to lead it and what weapons they have in their arsenal?
Well, look, I think it's going to be it's a fascinating time for the Democratic Party. It's in such disarray at this point, and as you said yesterday on the show, given the fact that the Democrats control neither the House nor the Senate nor the presidency starting in January, the head of the DNC is a super important job because it could be the main voice of opposition to Donald Trump and of the Democratic Party. So, look, I think Keith Ellison right now, because of where the strength is in this party, may not be the right choice. But I think Keith Ellison right now, with Bernie Sanders' backing, with a lot of the left on his side, is, I would say, the front runner. And I think that, that Howard Dean obviously has done this job before. But I have to say that the ascendant forces and where those forces are, what they think about why Hillary Clinton lost, what they think about how Bernie Sanders and the left was treated in the nomination fight, they have the whip hand right now in terms of taking control and in terms of, I think, winning this election for the DNC chair.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's an insider election, as we all know. Who knows what DNC members are thinking? They have not been canvassed yet. The party's going to have to decide in the lame duck session and then in the new Congress and the new president. Are they going to filibuster? What's going to be their strategy?
Filibuster,
nominees, everything. I mean, if this were the Republican Party and a Democratic president, the mirror image of Donald Trump, you'd be hearing Ted Cruz talking about filibustering everything. So what will Elizabeth Warren do? What will Bernie Sanders do? And also, what will Donald Trump do? The reality is Donald Trump could propose legislation that Democrats like on some issues, infrastructure, maybe tax reform even. And it's going to be fascinating to see just how organized Democrats are without the megaphone of the White House, without a majority in either chamber. How are they going to get on the same page about what to say about Trump while they look for leaders for 2 years from now and 4 years from now? And they have a very tough Senate map in 2 years.
Yeah, right. And look, I mean, you think about it, I'll say something that many on the left will find heretical. If you go back and look over Donald Trump's career, there's a reason why conservatives didn't like him, even before he got deep into this campaign, which is that he had a lot of liberal positions on a lot of issues. Democrats might be able to take advantage of that to their if they play it the right way.
We'll be talking about this a lot coming up, though. We're going to switch back to the Republicans. The congressman from Oklahoma, Tom Cole, joins us to talk about Donald Trump's relationship with the co-equal branch on Capitol Hill right after this.
Joining us now from the Sooner State is Tom Cole, Republican congressman from Oklahoma. Congressman, how are you doing, and how do you think, more importantly, at this early phase, how do you think Donald Trump is doing so far?
Oh, we're off to an awfully good start. Look, I think he's behaved in a very presidential manner from election evening, obviously, to his public appearances with the president and with the speaker yesterday. We're pretty giddy, obviously, if you're a Republican. I think we woke up Tuesday morning thinking, gosh, it's going to be another 4 years where we're the firewall, and woke up Wednesday morning and said we're going to get a chance to be the tip of the spear. So we're pretty excited.
Tom, you got majority control of both chambers in the White House. Should President Trump, when he takes office, consult Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer on legislation, or just consult you all?
No, he should actually work across the aisle where he can. Look, there are certainly some areas that we're not going to agree. We're not going to agree about the repeal of Obamacare. We're going to disagree about tax policy. But on something like infrastructure, if we can find common ground, we absolutely should.
So, for instance, on tax policy, you don't think he should take into account what Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer want? That should be an all-Republican affair?
No, look, I think you listen to everybody, and if you can find common ground, you seek it and you go forward. Democrats, like Republicans, are concerned that our tax codes encouraged businesses to locate offshore. I think Democrats, like Republicans, think we've got a lot of money stranded offshore that we'd like to see come home and be invested here. So, again, I can see some areas where we can find common ground. We should do it. But we also should remember that we were given this mandate, if you will, for a reason, and not be shy about using it on things like the repeal of Obamacare, where our base feels strongly and, frankly, where Republican members have never been supportive.
Guys, we've had some discussion in just these last 24 hours of who might fill some important posts in the administration. One of those jobs is White House Chief of Staff. Reince Priebus is a name that's been floated and kind of endorsed by Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan. But we're also hearing some discussion of the possibility that Steve Bannon could be the White House Chief of Staff. What message would it send if Mr. Trump were to decide to put Steve Bannon in that job?
Well, look, first of all, I'm going to work with anybody the president-elect chooses to be his chief of staff. It's none of my business to dictate who his personnel are, and that's a choice he needs to make. It needs to be somebody he's comfortable with. Obviously, I know Reince very well, and I think he's done a spectacular job, and I'd be happy there. But there's a lot of different people that can fill that role, and again, that's ultimately the president-elect's decision, and I think whoever he chooses, the Republican members of Congress will be happy to work with him.
Congressman, I'm just asking you to try to answer my question there, which is what message do you think it would send if he put Steve Bannon, the guy who was the head of Breitbart News, into that job?
And look, not for me to interpret that. I think the most important thing for any chief of staff is that they have a strong personal relationship with the president-elect. That is uniquely his decision. So we're going to work with whoever he chooses. And again, I'll leave that decision to the guy that won the presidency.
Let's get down in the weeds a little bit on health care. Most of my discussions with people in the healthcare industry is we don't love the Affordable Care Act, but we spent a lot of time adjusting to it. And if it gets repealed, we're going to have to spend a lot of time retraining, readjusting, extraordinary costs. What can your party do as you repeal it to try to get the healthcare sector to not be disrupted again?
Well, there's quite a few things, obviously, that the House has laid out in its Better Way agenda that the president-elect talked about in his own campaign. Things like selling insurance across state lines, associated health care plans, obviously health savings accounts, medical liability reform. But to your point, again, I think this has to be done thoughtfully. It'll probably have to be done through reconciliation. We're not going to get a lot of Democratic votes since most of them voted for Obamacare to repeal it. So we're going to have to move carefully. But I think it's a really important commitment that Republicans have made. They've made it consistently over several years. At the end of the day, it's absolutely essential that we do repeal Obamacare and we replace it with something that, in our view, works better for the American people.
Do you think there's a consensus, an actual workable consensus among Republicans on what replace would look like?
I think there is, and I think, frankly, even folks that might have questions or quibble with this or that, at the end of the day, are going to fall, in line behind what the White House requests. So we're fortunate right now to have Paul Ryan as the Speaker. He probably knows more about these kinds of policy issues than anybody else in Congress. He's not just a political tactician. He's a policy guy. So again, if the Speaker of the House comes to me and says, "I think this is the way to go," it's pretty easy for me to respect his opinion.
Congressman, people talk about infrastructure, tax reform. What else would you like to see handled early on next year in big, big bills?
Well, again, probably I would like to see us move ahead, and I'm not sure we will, on some entitlement reform. I don't think that was really adequately addressed in the campaign, but that's something I feel strongly about. I would like to see us make sure that sequester does not happen to the American military. I think that's absolutely critical, and I'm pleased the President-elect has basically taken that same position. And I'd like to see, long-term, that we actually do border security. I think that's something that's actually much more popular on both sides of the aisle than has been commonly recognized. Look, I don't care if you're a liberal Democrat or conservative Republican, you believe the borders of the country ought to be secure. The debate has been whether you do something comprehensive or you move pieces of legislation individually. Border security, I think we could move individually, and I think you could get significant Democratic support.
Congressman, are you confident that Paul Ryan will still be Speaker come February?
I'm absolutely confident. Boy, nothing heals wounds like victory, and I've been on any number of conference calls in the last 48 hours. There's not a whiff of opposition to any of our top four leaders. I think people know that we owe this Republican majority certainly to the President-elect, but also to Speaker Ryan. Nobody raised more money. Nobody worked harder. He gave us an agenda to run on. I think our members are genuinely pleased with his leadership, and I don't sense any significant challenge for him at all.
In the time between now and the President-elect takes office, there are a lot of Americans, including a lot of Republican elites, concerned about the question of whether he's ready to be commander-in-chief. What are things he could do before he took office to try to calm people who have that concern?
Well, again, not up to me to make those points or suggestions, but you made a couple of pretty good ones yourself. Look, I think when you become the president, you reach out to other people. I think the President-elect did that, again, when he visited the White House. I appreciate President Obama being as gracious as he was. I appreciate President-elect Trump handling it the way he did. Personally, I would go back to some of those communities that aren't historically Republican, African-American communities. I would go to a mosque. There's some things like that that I think would be, really important in a symbolic sense to try and reach out and be inclusive and reassure people. But again, I think the opening moves by the President-elect have been very, very good. So I would hope he builds on what he's done over the last 48 or 72 hours.
All right, Congressman Cole, thanks a lot for coming on. Coming up, we'll discuss the future of the Republican Party after these words from our sponsors.
Welcome back. A quick news update. The cable news network says that Donald Trump's former campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski has resigned from the network where he has worked as an analyst amidst some controversy and amid expectation that he may, or speculation I should say, that he may take a job in the new Obama administration. With us now.
Trump administration.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Trump administration,
Yeah.
that too.
Yeah.
With us now, Pete Wenner, Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's been doing a lot of thinking over the last few years about the future of the Republican Party and doing more now in the wake of Donald Trump's victory, and he joins us from Washington. Pete, you've written quite a bit over the last few months about Donald Trump. Is there anything you've seen since he got elected that makes you more hopeful about his presidency than you were when he was a candidate?
Well, look, I think he's handled the last 48, 72 hours pretty well. But look, this is the easy stuff. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you expect. I think he's been gracious enough. I think President Obama's been gracious. But we're just going to have to wait and see. We have to see the appointments that he makes, both within the White House and his cabinet. And really, the test is going to become and begin on January 20th. And it's going to accelerate after that. So I just don't think we have enough to go on. What we've seen so far, which is very early, very preliminary, he's been fine.
So Pete, when there were people who were never Trump during the campaign,
Right.
who then changed their mind once he became the Republican nominee, your view of those people was what? People who had said that
Well,
Trump would be a cancer, for instance, on conservatism, and then ended up endorsing him shortly after he won the nomination. Your view of them was what?
Well, it really depended on the individuals and how passionate they were and what their reasons were. I think they made a mistake. Look, I thought and think that Donald Trump was a malignant and malicious force in the political landscape.
Right.
And I was quite worried what would happen if he becomes president. Now we're going to test that proposition, and I may be wrong, and I hope I am. I do think that the people who were never Trump and really spoke in vivid language, like Bobby Jindal and Rick Perry and others did, and then they flipped around and came behind him. I was not impressed with that. I think that that they put the party above their convictions. Right. And I think that they were potentially opportunistic.
Right.
That said, look, a lot of my friends were Trump supporters, not enthusiastically, but they were, and I understood the calculation that they made.
Yep.
I just disagreed with it.
I was using that kind of as a setup question to the next question, which is what is one to do if one was a consistent never Trumper throughout the entirety, all the way up until Election Day, and now you're confronted with, and this is you basically. You're now confronted with someone who you've said incredibly negative things about, his character, his temperament, his personality, his intellect. Suddenly he's now the president of the United States. So what is a man like you to do in these circumstances?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. I mean, there is such a thing as democratic legitimacy, and you have to recognize that. I mean, the people voted for him. We only get one president. He is it, and that matters. And there is something about coming a kind of democratic grace. I think that a person like myself has to give him the benefit of the doubt and allow him to prove me wrong, and see how he does. And I have to be intellectually honest here. If he does things that I agree with or that advance the interests of the country, that advance justice, I need to say that. On the other hand, the people who were defenders of Trump also have an obligation to be intellectually honest here too. And if he does things that require that he be challenged and criticized, they should do that. And, my posture here is to wait and see. I may be wrong. I've been wrong before. I felt like I saw enough during the campaign to convince me that he was not a man who was qualified temperamentally or intellectually to be president. But now he's going to be, and we'll test the propositions and see who was right and who was wrong.
You have respect for Paul Ryan and your friends, right?
Yeah, both.
And you have respect for Mike Pence, and I believe you're friends with him as well?
Not friends with him, but,
okay,
but know him and respect him.
So those two guys are going to be pretty big players in the Trump administration, right? Does that give you any comfort?
Yeah, it does give me some comfort, and I hope as he houses his administration, fills it up, that there are going to be people of high quality, and I hope, frankly, that he defers to Paul Ryan on the agenda. If he does that, I'd be very, very comforted. But I will say this, the entire argument throughout the campaign was that these people who would surround Trump, including Paul and Mike Pence, is that they could contain him, that they could control him. And the line that was used again and again and again as it related to Trump was he would become more presidential. And he never did. There were moments, weeks that he was okay, but then he would revert to type. And there was nobody in the campaign that could ever really control him and control his worst impulses. And they kept coming. And as the campaign went on, he got worse, not better. And if that continues in the presidency, then we're in for real trouble. Now we don't know. Maybe he will grow in the job, but my reading of history is that people with that are narcissistic and have disordered personalities, when they get virtually unlimited power, they don't get better, they get worse. But he may be the exception. I hope he is, for the sake of the republic.
Do you have a sense, Pete, that I mean, one of the things that's been true about Trump, beyond some of the things that he did that offended a lot of people, there were, for people like you who are conservative, the question of whether he was an actual conservative or not. Or,
yeah.
I mean, obviously, in some of the things he put forward as policy prescriptions were decidedly unconservative. So do you imagine that what we're going to see now is an attempt to run a conservative administration? Or do you imagine that a lot of the past Donald Trump positions from even before he ran, which were quite liberal in a lot of respects, are going to suddenly now bubble to the surface, and we're going to be actually confronting a really ideologically undoctrinaire kind of president here?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the truth is, I don't imagine anything at this point, because I really don't know. I think more than any president we've ever had in our lifetime, and maybe in American history, we just don't know what to expect for a couple of reasons. One is he was so policy ignorant. He was all over the map on so many issues, as you said, and he has no philosophical roots. So there's no real way to understand how he's going to govern, or what are the principles that are going to govern him. He seems to govern by impulse and by gut, and this, you know, he could feel one way one week and another way another week. So he could govern as a conservative. He could turn left. It could be an odd mix. It could be, depending on who his chief of staff is and who he talks to before he goes to sleep at night. So I really don't know. That's one of the fascinating things that will unfold. But I don't think that there's any way, even people who know Trump, and I would suspect even Donald Trump doesn't frankly know how he's going to govern at this stage.
Pete, one of the things we so respect about you is you think about leadership and about examples that leaders set and how it impacts young people. What should parents tell who don't like Donald Trump and who feel the way you do about his character? What should they tell their young children about President Trump? Should they avoid speaking badly about him in front of young kids? Should they give him that democratic grace that you talked about in front of kids?
Yeah, boy, that's a good question. I've had conversations with people about that. It's a hard one. I mean, I don't think you can erase the past. Of course, it depends on the age of the child, but I don't think you can erase the past. I think what you need to say is that he made mistakes, but he's now the president, and we owe certain things to the president because we owe certain things to the country. But above all, we owe things to the truth and to justice and to what is right, and we're just going to have to monitor and see what happens. I just will say that the way he acted during this campaign, his treatment of women and of Gold Star families and people with disabilities and all of the rest, was just very difficult. People pay attention, kids pay attention, and the kind of thing that you teach people in terms of how they ought to conduct themselves in life, when you have a presidential candidate and then a president-elect win, that kind of thing can be validated. And when that happens, it's not good for the culture. So it's not an easy situation. It can be overcome if he conducts himself with a certain degree of dignity and respects other people. Then maybe this will be, over time, if not forgotten, than in the midst of time. But if he doesn't, if he continues to act as president as he did as a candidate, a lot of damage is going to be done to the country, including our civic and political culture, and that matters in a free country.
Pete, let me ask you a last question real quick. We talked about this earlier on the show. There seems to be evidence of a lot of Trump-related hate speech, hate crimes, ugly incidents that are taking place in the name of Donald Trump around the country right now. Mark and I talked about what we think Donald Trump should do about that. First of all, what do you think he should do? And second of all, how important a test is this for him as president-elect right now?
I agree with both you guys. I think he needs to speak to it. I think he needs to speak directly to it. These are people who are presumably supporters of him, and while he's not responsible for their actions, they are acting in some respects, if not in his name, because of his victory. And I just think he has, beyond all of that, just as a utilitarian, as a prudential matter, he has a power and effect over them that others would not, precisely because they look up to him. So I just think he needs to speak to it, and I think he needs to talk about how we ought to conduct ourselves. He's in a different position now. I don't know if he knows that yet. I hope he does. I hope if he doesn't yet that he will. But I just think that he has to say that this is not appropriate, and he's got to begin to speak about how we view each other, including people who have views that are different than ours. This has been as angry and contentious and rancorous an election as I've ever seen in my life, and a lot of healing has to occur. One of the reasons, the main reason it's been that anger, that contentious and rancorous, is because of Donald Trump. So he's got some work to do to undo it. On the other hand, the people who are critics of Trump have their obligations too. And the people that are rioting and that kind of stuff, I mean, that is really bad, and he has every right to speak to them as well. There are ways you conduct yourselves in a free country, and one of them is to respect the results and to come together. Lincoln was able to do it after the Civil War. That was a heck of a lot worse than this is now. He talked about with malice toward none, with charity towards all. He talked about that we're friends, not enemies. If Lincoln could do it, then we can. He's still the model.
Yeah. Pete Winter, thoughtful as always. Thanks for coming in. Great to have you on.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Every time. Coming up, more on Donald Trump's trip to Washington, D.C. from earlier in the week in the notebook of the Washington Post and Guerin right after this.
In a brief interview with the Wall Street Journal today, Donald Trump said that he was open to keeping a couple of provisions in Obamacare, particularly having to do with the pre-existing condition coverage and additional years of coverage for kids. Those are important signals, and we'll be talking about those a lot more as we go forward. But joining us now to dissect the week's election outcome, what happened and what comes next, is Ann Guerin, a national political reporter for the Washington Post. She joins us now from Washington, D.C. Ann, you have been focused a lot on Democrats and the disarray in the party at this moment. Suddenly fingers being pointed all kinds of different directions, obviously at the Clinton campaign, but even to some extent at President Obama. Talk about the blame game that's going on in the party right now.
Yeah, there's a little blood in the water right now. There was a sort of a chaotic scene at a DNC meeting yesterday with at least one staffer blaming interim chair Donna Brazile and her cohorts, cronies, really. I think the guy said for bombing the election, for focusing on the wrong things. The Clinton campaign had a hand-holding call yesterday with some of their surrogates, and then again today with donors, where they largely blamed external forces. Felt that they were swamped in a change election, and that the force of the economic unrest and anger over that had a Brexit effect. Did not talk about faults in the candidate or in their strategy, the choices of what states to to concentrate on or other kind of, mechanics. And that is having that is not sitting well with some Democrats who feel like even in the midst of a change election and all the various forces that were legitimately arrayed against Hillary Clinton at the start, the campaign made some missteps and aren't really owning it now.
And you and others will write stories fleshing all this out. Do you think this will boil over and become a public dispute, or a couple stories will be written and then the party will move on?
I don't know, but my gut says the latter. I think there's speaking of anger and frustration, there's some anger and frustration among Democrats, and they're venting right now. But the imperative to mobilize against Trump and have a united front against him to push things that Democrats care about, even as soon as during this transition, is already starting to win out, and certainly on a couple of these calls, as I've heard them recounted, there was a real move to say, look, we have to stay united. We have to focus on the things, our priorities legislatively. We have to focus on the message that we want to have in opposition to a Trump White House. And we have to begin focusing on the midterm election.
So, Ann, there's been some finger pointing, as I said before, specifically at Robbie Mook and others in the Clinton campaign, about the notion of ignoring white working class voters, especially in the context of President Clinton apparently having raised the alarm about this throughout. But so far, we're not hearing a lot of finger pointing within the Clinton orbit, like people inside her campaign blaming each other. Where do you think that story goes forward?
That's been a hallmark of this campaign. There has not been a lot of infighting. There's been really no big public fight. Nobody prominently got fired throughout an 18-month campaign. That's kind of remarkable. I don't really expect to see it now. Mook commanded extraordinary loyalty within the campaign. He was really seen for all his youth as being a very mature leader, and I don't expect to see him suffer hugely politically as a result of this. But I do hear a fair amount of grumbling from people outside the campaign, just that the campaign isn't fully taking, what's left of the campaign isn't fully taking ownership of some things that they should have done differently.
And I rarely ask reporters media questions, but I'm really interested in this because it does affect the future of the next few months. How has the Washington Post newsroom reorienting itself over the last 48 hours in what everyone there, or most everyone there, expected would be covering a Clinton administration towards now covering a Trump administration?
Well, it's very much a work in progress, and most of the decisions, in fact, all of the decisions will not be mine, but it's definitely a different landscape. There were a whole bunch of people who assumed that they would be covering a Clinton White House, like at the White House, and a whole bunch of other people who assumed that they would be covering Republicans in opposition, and so just like the many other maps are being switched around, ours is as well. I don't know what I will do. I think it will probably have a politics and foreign policy combo beat, which takes me back to my foreign policy days. But I don't know. TBD.
Okay.
Well, looking forward to reading whatever you write, Ann Gearing, because you are great, and we're happy to have you.
Thank
always. We will check in next with the professor, Dr. Eddie Glaude, in just a moment. If you happen to be watching us in Washington, D.C., always keep in mind that you can listen to us as well on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM, and we'll be right back.
Eddie Glaude is a professor of religion and African American studies at Princeton University. One of our favorite people to talk to when the nation's in crisis. Don't take that the wrong way. Professor, thank you for joining us. I'd love to just hear about your day. I saw you on Morning Joe. What have you heard today from people you've interacted with about how they're dealing with President-elect Trump?
Well, I mean, it's been a day of trauma, a day of kind of trying to figure out where we're going to move, where we're going to go next, a day of dealing with, in some ways, the unleashing of ugliness. I mean, we just heard, it's circulating on Twitter now, that all of the black freshmen at University of Pennsylvania have been added to a GroupMe group entitled Nigger Lynching. So people are trying to make sense of this. And trying to figure out how they're going to stay safe and how they're going to respond. So it's still as tense as it was on Election Day.
Eddie, you know, we've talked on the show already about everybody who we've talked to so far, including us here, think that Donald Trump needs to address this and address it in a constructive way if he has any hope of healing the country and being a successful president. What if he doesn't? You know, in the past, as a candidate, we often called on him to denounce anti-Semites, anti-Semitic tweets. He never did. Never distanced himself from some of the uglier elements of his constituency. So what happens if he just says, you know, I'm not going to do anything about this, not my problem?
Well, I think he gives license to the hate. He gives license to people to act on that hate. And he's going to create the conditions for chaos. I would like, you know, some people like to represent this moment as akin to redemption, you know, right after the collapse of radical Reconstruction, and the South kind of regains control over its region, right? And they like to liken this to a kind of second redemption. But this isn't 1876. And people who believe that they can come into our communities and bully and be aggressive and threaten our children, they're going to be in for a surprise. And so unless President-elect Trump actually reaches for being a statesman, we might find ourselves on the precipice of serious chaos and bloodshed.
And I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm hoping that Jared Kushner and the White House press secretary, Josh Earnest, are listening. What would you think of the idea of President Obama and Donald Trump putting out a joint statement condemning this stuff?
Well, you know, I think, that could help, but, you know, President Obama has been, for the last 8 years, the interpreter-in-chief to white America with regards to Black Lives Matter. He has responded to Baltimore, Milwaukee, Charlotte, and in some ways, by him coming to the side of Donald Trump in this way, he would work in some ways, Mark, as a kind of black male nurse, the kind of stereotypical, rendering of black folk as kind of, in some ways, comforting the nation. Donald Trump needs to do this on his own. He needs to address what he released over the course of his campaign. And, you know, the kind of aspirational claims that many people are making, that perhaps he will turn a corner, that he will be presidential, that he will govern all America. The only evidence we have before us right now is that he was the candidate who declared a ban on Muslims. He was the candidate who called undocumented workers rapists and criminals. He was the guy who in some ways sanctioned violence at his rallies. He was the guy who in some ways let the genie out of the bottle and sanctioned all of this ugliness we're seeing now. He has to do it, and he has to do it alone, Mark.
Okay, Professor, thank you so much. Always great to have you on as well. John and I will be right back.
Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. The world mourns the loss of the legendary singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen, who died last night. And yet today we celebrate the birth of the new Tribe Called Quest album. For this lyrical circle of life, we have one word. Quoting Mr. Cohen, hallelujah. Bloomberg Technology is next. And until Monday, from me and Mark here on this Friday, thank God it's the weekend, and sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg Technology. Let's begin with first word news. Vice President-elect Mike Pence now leads Donald Trump's transition team. He replaces embattled New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, who last week saw 2 former aides convicted in the Bridgegate